Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Richardson. I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas, and I'm here with Ben Pickett. He's the Executive Minister at West Houston Church of Christ in Northwest Houston. So thank you, Ben, so much for joining me today to have a conversation.
Sure, Bridget. Glad to be with you. It's awesome.
Yeah. So you're an executive minister at West Houston Church of Christ. So I wanted to chat with you about the adjustments that you've had to make now that COVID-19 is alive and well. Unfortunately, churches are having to make adjustments in terms of meeting and embracing media and things like that and communicating it with those who attend their services. So just overarching, how has this been affecting West Houston Church of Christ?
Yeah, I suspect it's like everybody else. I think it was a couple of weeks ago when, here in Houston at least, when the first request from our local authorities, the mayor and the governor and others said, hey, you need to start distancing and reducing your group sizes to 10 or less, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's been a couple of weeks now. And so the first thing we had to do is transition everything to online format. Now, we, in terms of our worship assemblies, now, thankfully, we had already set up and had the structures in place to go ahead and provide an online option, but that was only for one of our two assemblies. And so we had to immediately adjust how we were doing everything really on Sunday morning. And it became kind of a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
We realized that what was being broadcast, we could do better and make it a little more personal because, you know, you're accustomed to showing on your worship stream, you know, the church, in addition to those that are up on the platform leading. Well, there's nobody in the church. And so seeing empty pews really is not very encouraging for a Sunday assembly. And so we made some adjustments there. But the first thing, of course, like everybody else, we had to adjust to life being in our homes and not being able to assemble on Sunday mornings. And so that really was the priority, to get that up and running very quickly. And then, of course, in the days that followed, we had to change office operations, staff, and ministry operations. No more meetings at the building. Ministry staff, we had to shift and get into a work-at-home mode. And so that required, establishing some good communication with everyone and putting that in place. As a church ministry staff, one of the things that we quickly recognized, and this came from our senior minister, that we needed to focus on three primary areas as we shifted into this new mode. And that was, we needed to be intentional about encouraging and supporting our church in terms of what it means to be a disciple. In other words, we need to be intentional about what discipleship means now that we're in this place as opposed to where we were, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the first things we felt we had to focus on, was to encourage and build up the church and to and maybe even lean into some education initiatives about what discipleship means, just to remind us. And the second piece was to care deeply about those who were affected by the pandemic. And so who were the groups that were most vulnerable. And so, the information's come out, the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions that made them immunocompromised, people that were in those categories seem to be more susceptible to the disease. And so we took intentional steps to create lines of communication with those groups. And so our shepherds and others, we worked together to identify those groups and then begin making contacts with them almost immediately, just to see how they're doing, what needs, if any, they have. We also created lines of communication for pastoral care needs for across the church family. So we very quickly made folks aware that if they needed to email or contact someone to talk with them for prayer or just conversation, we made ourselves available to that. We established a text to pray line. We set up all those systems in place. And then as we kind of got into it, we realized, wait, there's going to be some benevolence requests and some other needs that pop up. So we established some other systems where if in the event that there were people who needed their yard mowed or needed someone to go and run errands for them because they couldn't get out or were afraid to get out, we had some volunteers and a system in place to help support that. So that all happened in about 10 days, Bridget. This is how crazy this was. Everything shifted from the building and us meeting, and if there was an issue, you'd call a meeting at the building and folks would bring lunch and you'd talk, right? Or you'd meet at the coffee shop to, wait a minute, we've got to do all of this online. We've got to do all of this remotely. And we've got to get all these systems in place to serve these highly impacted groups. So that's kind of what's happened. Yeah. And it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but it's been good. I think one other piece is kind of tied to what I just mentioned in those areas. One other piece was we wanted to make sure to do all we could to use the internet, to use Facebook, to use Instagram, other platforms to help folks engage in church life as much as possible. So we launched a Facebook campaign on our West Houston page, where twice a day you'll see content focused on worship or teaching or community or service throughout the week, just to help people get engaged. If they're seeking that kind of content, it's available there for them. So that's what we've been doing. That's it in a nutshell. I'll stop there for response or other thoughts.
But that's a lot. I mean, some people are still trying to figure it out. Like, where do we go? But you seem your team has come together and put in a whole infrastructure for this digital presence. And what was that teamwork like? I mean, it's pretty incredible, all the things that you're describing.
Well, obviously, when you're working with a talented group, and we've got some folks on our staff that have some real expertise in how social media works. Obviously, our student and children's ministries take advantage of those platforms. And so we drew on their expertise to think through, okay, how can we fully be as present as we can using these systems that are already in place? And how can we be effective in the material that we present, right? Because there's a way to do that and do it well. And so that was part of the conversation. But like I mentioned earlier, those three things, encouraging and helping the church, lean into areas of discipleship, and then also caring for those most in need, particularly the elderly. And then third is community engagement. That was the third piece I didn't mention earlier. Mm-hmm. And we're working right now on what that community engagement looks like. I think the first thing I know everyone needs to be reminded of is that churches that choose not to meet are doing so out of love for their community. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're choosing not to meet because we know that that's in the best interest of our neighbors. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a bit of a hot topic right now. Some churches are insisting on continuing to meet. You've heard the stories, you've seen the articles, mm-hmm. but I think it is an act of love for us to go to these efforts for the sake of the community. And we have to think about, okay, what does it say to the rest of our community if we're unwilling to respond in ways that we know would be helpful to the community? Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the questions that's really important for us to ask, not only from the impulse, okay, what's in the best interest of our neighbor? That's the first question. What does it mean to be Christ-like to neighbor in something like this? Well, for churches, it makes all kinds of sense for us to say, you know what, if we're being asked not to meet and we have other ways, thank God for the internet, right? Can you imagine? Yeah, think about that for a second. Right. And so if we can still find ways to be meaningfully engaged and connected, it's not ideal, mm-hmm. and we pray it doesn't last. But if that's for a season, and in that season we're able to be a people that recognize, look, for the sake of others, we're going to go this route. Mm-hmm. I think that's the kind of message we need to be sending as Christ followers. And so I appreciate the fact that our staff has worked so hard and diligently to make that happen. I really do.
And what has been the reception of that message to not only those who attend West Houston Church of Christ, but maybe to the larger community as y'all put out your communications?
Well, I'd hope to, it's interesting. I know our church has appreciated the work that we're doing. to still try to find some way to bring us together for Sunday assemblies. This is what every church is doing, and I appreciate it. Because every church is at different levels of technology. Some had had the resources and the expertise to go ahead and put that together. Others are catching up very quickly because they're realizing that online option does matter, even if it's not live. Even a recorded option still helps. My prayer is after all this is over that the community will have noticed what churches are doing. It's hard to gauge right now. I'm sure there's information out there. I haven't seen it, but we've been pretty busy. But my hope is when this all is over that the community would see that the church at large, at least for the most part, recognized how it could help with managing something that's very difficult to get through, and not being seen as a barrier or heaven forbid making matters worse, right? And so that's to me, that would be really important, that kind of message that the church would be sending.
Yeah. And just for people watching who maybe don't know what Church of Christ is or have never experienced a service like that, can you give us like a bird's eye view of what it is and what a Sunday service might look like?
Sure. We're, as you know, we're a Protestant church, part of the Protestant Free Church tradition, Churches of Christ that began at the very early parts of the 19th century. And so, like most churches, we'll celebrate communion together. We'll have a time of worship. For us at West Houston, we have both an a cappella service, which is our tradition to sing a cappella music, just the voices, right? Hymns over the years, we all sing together. In the more recent decades, instrumental worship has kind of been added to several churches in our tradition. And so we have both an a cappella and an instrumental service. And so the mornings will look like a period of worship. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll share in communion together, and then there'll be a speaker that will share a sermon with us. That's Brian Offit, our senior minister here at West Houston. And he'll provide a sermon, and then there'll be a time, other what we call acts of worship, other things that we do together would typically involve an offering. Now, with online, everything kind of changes. Communion looks different, right? And our time of giving together looks different. Our time of mutual fellowship, where I think in other traditions it's called passing the peace, right? Or expressing peace to one another. Yes, we don't call it that. We don't pass the peace in Church of Christ, but we do have a welcome. Like, okay, reach out to your neighbor and say hi, which is in kind of the same spirit. And so all those things obviously make for what a typical Sunday morning on our campus would look like in our worship center. But otherwise, you're going to see those basic elements. And so I think it's the instrumental worship assembly is going to have more contemporary music, and it will be reflective of some of the contemporary music you hear on the radio. There'll be some of that, but there are some songs that we lean into because they fit closer to our theological commitments. But by and large, it'll reflect that music that you see there. So that's kind of what it's like in the Churches of Christ. Now, not all Churches of Christ are exactly the same, but you'll see those elements, right? You'll see those pillars in our worship assemblies.
Yeah, you mentioned something that's really interesting about communion, because in the Catholic community right now, we're trying to figure that out because we can't receive communion. And I wonder, at West Houston, have you experienced that people have that sense of longing? Are they still taking communion? I know through during your service, you encourage people to grab bread, y'all pray over it, grab grape juice, that kind of thing. So what's that like for your communion? Because I know Catholics, they're still trying to kind of sort through that longing of not being able to receive.
Yeah, I can understand that. This is where, our faith traditions probably most certainly differ, right? In the theology of the Eucharist, theology and belief systems around communion. Right. Because of our Protestant heritage, we tend to see communion more as a memorial. Right. And so as a result, the emblems are representative of the body and blood of Christ. And so typically we'll use grape juice or and unleavened bread, like a cracker, unsalted crackers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so us being able to share in communion together, even if it's online, still kind of brings us all together in that moment. It really does. And so we do encourage folks to participate in communion together. There's a moment in our assemblies each Sunday, even online, where we pause and we ask folks at home, okay, if you have grape juice and some cracker, that's great. If you got something close, God is merciful and God is gracious, and it'll be okay. But the point is, we're all sharing in that moment, and we're remembering the body and blood of Christ. We're remembering the sacrifice. We're remembering that it is Christ that brings us together. That is Christ's table. That in this moment, figuratively, we're joining and surrounding in our hearts. And so that's kind of how we do communion right now. We can't do it together, but in person, but we can do it together in spirit. And so I think that's still very much a part of our morning ritual routine with our assemblies.
And how do you mentioned the volunteers who are giving of themselves to go and pick up groceries for people and things like that? Like, how do you see this whole experience, in spite of the crisis and the anxiety that people are feeling? How do you see it as a coming together for your community, or a sign of hope, or even, giving people the opportunity to step up and reach out like that?
Yeah, here's the thing. Our calling as disciples, of followers of Jesus, right, is to see the bigger picture and see that God is still sovereign, right, and that Christ still inspires us to serve and to love others before ourselves, regardless of circumstances, right? And so it is our faith that inspires us to do these things. And so my hope is, when this is over, we'll have stories and pictures and testimonies, people's experiences shared to remind us of what it meant to be Christian, even in a season like this. And so for us, as leaders and volunteers, it's so important for us to remember what God is calling us to and what God is calling us to be through all of this. And that is not be afraid, to not be anxious. I'm reminded of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and 6 and following, where Jesus teaches us not to worry. I think he was serious when he said that. And that really becomes an important text, an important message for us, particularly in times like these, where the future now is so much more uncertain than it has been, and where our routines are, completely flipped upside down. And now we're finding ourselves working out of our spare rooms and closets, and, and our kids are all over the house, that kind of thing, all that disruption. And then, heaven forbid, you spend too much time watching the news. Okay. Right. And so our faith empowers us to love others. And I'm looking forward to the days ahead when we come back together and we can share those stories about how folks loved and served one another. That's the Christian witness to those who don't know Jesus, in my view.
Yeah. And so just kind of to tie it all together, what are you saying to those at West Houston and anyone who's watching right now, just not only to be calm and know the peace that only Christ can give us, but also how do you make available that reaching out? How do you do that when you feel so nervous about going out or doing something like that?
Well, I think obviously maybe I'll start here. I still want to encourage everyone to as best as possible to tune into our Sunday assemblies.
And how do they do that?
Where, I think that's really important. And I know that might sound a little cliche, or you just plug in your worship. But actually, though, for members at West Houston, that worship's going to still look very familiar, right? And to whatever church you're a part of, when that assembly is being broadcast, it looks familiar, and then you remind yourself, wait a minute, this is part of my faith. This is part of my faith commitment to engage in community life, to engage in church life.
Mhm.
And so when we hear messages from our senior minister, when you hear messages from others reminding us of the constancy of God's promises, of the abundant love God has for us, and the call to love others above ourselves, that's intrinsic to what we see in the life of Christ. I think tuning in to worship and being reminded of themes like that is really important right now. And to know that we're not in this alone, that we're part of something much bigger. And people can feel really isolated right now. And that's natural. But at the same time, you know, being encouraged and reminded that there are others that that are walking this with you, and that God is also in the midst, I think really does matter. So that's what I'd say I'd encourage folks in that way.
That's wonderful. And if somebody wants to tune into West Houston and see what y'all do, how would they do that?
Yeah, just go to our website, westhoustonchurch.org. All the appropriate buttons are right there in front.
Okay.
You can tune into the assemblies and some other content. Like I said, we're doing a lot on Facebook, and we're making sure that there's plenty of content for all ages there, including our children's and student ministries, as well as support efforts that can support adults in their faith as well. So that's what I'd point people to.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. And you're just a wealth of knowledge. You're so familiar with that connection that we all yearn for with Christ. And so it's just such a joy to talk with you about this.
Thanks, Bridget. Appreciate the time and appreciate all you're doing to help inform others. It's really good work. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you so much.